You already know about the carrots and the breakfast lie. Good, because the food industry didn't stop there. Here are 51 more myths you've been confidently repeating, and every single one is wrong. 1. Celery juice has been marketed to you as a medical miracle. A vibrating green liquid that dissolves inflammation, heals autoimmune conditions, and flushes toxins that the medical establishment supposedly refuses to acknowledge. It is mildly hydrating vegetable water with an extraordinarily well-funded social media publicist. The medical medium movement, which is the primary source of celery juice gospel, is based on health claims received via psychic spirit communication. Not peer-reviewed research, not clinical trials, not a single published study. Celery itself is roughly 95% water. Its actual nutritional profile, small amounts of vitamin K, folate, and potassium, is comparable to dozens of other vegetables that nobody is squeezing into a cult following. The specific claims that celery juice kills Epstein-Barr virus and eradicates streptococcus have zero support in published virology or microbiology literature. Zero. The supposed active ingredient, undiscovered sodium cluster salts, is not a recognized compound in any nutritional biochemistry database on the planet because it was not discovered in a laboratory, it was announced. Blending celery into juice removes the fiber that makes whole vegetables beneficial in the first place and concentrates any naturally occurring pesticide residues if you didn't buy organic. The supplement and juicing industry generated estimated billions from this single trend, making it one of the most profitable wellness myths in recent social media history. You are taking medical advice from a man whose qualifications are supernatural, paying a produce surcharge for water and calling it healing. Tap water is free and equally as effective at not curing your autoimmune disease. The celery juice is not healing you. The belief that it might is doing all the work. 2. Every November, the same explanation gets passed around the dinner table like the gravy boat. The turkey's tryptophan knocked you out. Science confirmed it. Case closed. Your extended family repeats it with complete confidence. The turkey didn't drug you. The caloric equivalent of a small building did. Tryptophan is a real essential amino acid and a genuine precursor to serotonin and melatonin, and it does play a role in sleep regulation, but only in isolated high-dose supplement form consumed on an empty stomach. Turkey contains roughly 250 to 310 milligrams of tryptophan per 100 grams, which is comparable to chicken, pork, cheese, and sunflower seeds. None of those foods send anyone horizontal after a meal. To cross the blood-brain barrier efficiently, tryptophan must compete with other large neutral amino acids for transport. In a protein-rich meal, it loses that competition decisively, and very little of it reaches the brain at all. The real mechanism is postprandial somnolence, the physiological response to consuming a very large meal, during which blood is rerouted to the digestive system. Blood pressure drops slightly and the parasympathetic nervous system takes over. Add the significant carbohydrate load of stuffing, mashed potatoes, rolls, and pie, which does briefly facilitate tryptophan uptake through an insulin-mediated mechanism, and then factor in the alcohol a meaningful portion of adults are quietly consuming, and you have a complete biochemical explanation that has nothing to do with the bird on the table. The turkey has carried this blame for decades. It is innocent. You did this to yourself with a plate that required 2 hands to carry, and you pointed at the animal like it slipped something into your drink. The turkey is not the problem. Your portion size is the confession. 3. High heat first, always. Because it creates a seal. A protective crust that locks moisture inside the meat and keeps every flavorful drop exactly where it belongs. Every home cook repeats this. Most culinary instruction has historically included it as foundational technique. Searing creates no seal of any kind. The crust is not a moisture barrier, and it never was. Food scientist Harold McGee demonstrated definitively in the 1980s that seared meat loses moisture at rates comparable to or greater than unseared meat cooked to the same internal temperature. The crust formed by the Maillard reaction, the browning process that occurs at high heat, is a porous network of denatured proteins and caramelized compounds. It is not waterproof. A straightforward experiment confirms this. Weigh a seared steak and an unseared steak before and after cooking each to the same internal temperature. The seared version frequently loses equal or more weight and release moisture. The myth was popularized in the 19th century by German chemist Justus von Liebig, who proposed the sealing theory without empirical evidence. His scientific authority carried the claim for over a century without meaningful challenge. The actual reason seared meat tastes better has nothing to do with moisture retention. It has everything to do with the Maillard reaction, producing hundreds of complex flavor compounds that dramatically improve the surface taste profile. Reverse sear and sous vide cooking methods, which apply low heat first and finish with a brief high heat sear, consistently produce juicier results precisely because internal temperature rises gradually without the moisture shock of immediate high heat. You have spent years building a seal that functions like a screen door in a hurricane. The steak tastes better because of surface chemistry, the moisture you imagined you were trapping left anyway. 4. A shot of apple cider vinegar every morning, before food, preferably while grimacing, is presented to you as a metabolic cheat code that melts abdominal fat, balances blood sugar, and resets your entire digestive system from the inside out. Apple cider vinegar is diluted acetic acid in a bottle. It has some modest documented effects and a resume that is wildly out of proportion to the evidence. The most cited human study supporting apple cider vinegar for weight loss involved 175 Japanese participants over 12 weeks who lost an average of 1 to 2 pounds more than the control group. That is the scientific foundation for the entire Burns belly fat claim. 1 to 2 pounds over 12 weeks. Acetic acid does have a mild appetite suppressing effect and a modest impact on post-meal blood glucose, primarily by slowing gastric emptying. This is real. Calling it a fat-burning metabolism reset is not. Taken undiluted, apple cider vinegar is corrosive to tooth enamel, and long-term daily consumption has been linked in case reports to enamel erosion and esophageal damage, conditions that require significantly more than vinegar to repair. Apple cider vinegar does not detox the liver, reset gut flora, or dissolve visceral fat. None of these claims have any mechanistic basis in biochemistry. The mother in raw apple cider vinegar, the cloudy sediment frequently cited as the health active ingredient, is simply a colony of acetic acid bacteria and cellulose. Its additional benefit over filtered vinegar is negligible. The wellness industry markets apple cider vinegar in gummies, capsules, and tonics that often add more sugar than the modestly beneficial acetic acid can counteract. You are grimacing through an acidic morning ritual with all the metabolic impact of a firm handshake. Put it on the salad. Stop punishing yourself before breakfast. 5. Reaching for the brown egg at the grocery store feels like a small, responsible act. Brown eggs have a premium price, a premium shelf position, and an implied premium health profile. White eggs feel clinical and industrial. Brown eggs feel like they came from a weathered farm where a responsible hen made thoughtful decisions on your behalf. The color of an eggshell is determined entirely by the breed of the hen laying it and has zero nutritional significance whatsoever. White feathered hens with white earlobes, primarily leghorns, produce white eggs. Red or brown feathered hens with red earlobes, primarily Rhode Island Reds, produce brown eggs. That is the complete explanation. Nutritional comparison studies consistently show no meaningful difference in protein content, fat composition, vitamin levels, or mineral content between white and brown eggs of equivalent grade and production conditions. Brown eggs historically cost more because larger, heavier breeds consume more feed, making production marginally more expensive. The price premium is a cost markup, not a quality upgrade. The real factors that determine egg nutritional quality are the hen's diet and living conditions. pasture-raised and omega-3 enriched hens produce measurably different eggs regardless of shell color. A study comparing pasture-raised eggs against conventional eggs found significant differences in vitamin D, omega-3 fatty acids, and beta-carotene. None of that variation correlated with shell color. Marketing successfully exploited the cognitive association between brown coloring and words like wholesome and unprocessed. The same perceptual trick used to sell brown sugar, brown bread, and brown rice as automatic nutritional upgrades over their lighter equivalents. You have been paying a premium for a paint job determined by the hen's feather genetics. What is inside the egg has nothing to do with the outside of the shell. This lesson applies equally well to eggs and to most things in life. 6. Canola oil, soybean oil, sunflower oil. The online health community has decided that these are industrial lubricants disguised as cooking oils, causing runaway inflammation, destroying cellular function, and driving every chronic disease, defining modern health. The seed oil paranoia is a legitimate nutritional concern that has been dramatically extended into the territory of paranoid fiction. The genuine underlying concern that an excessive ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids in the diet can promote a pro-inflammatory physiological state is real and supported by research. That is where the valid science ends. Linoleic acid, the omega-6 fat primarily targeted in anti-seed oil content, does not simply become inflammatory in the body. The conversion pathway from linoleic acid to arachidonic acid, which is the precursor to inflammatory compounds, is heavily regulated and substantially limited in the healthy human metabolism. A 2020 systematic review in the Journal of Nutrition found no evidence that replacing saturated fats with vegetable oils increases inflammatory markers. Most trials showed neutral or beneficial outcomes. Refined seed oils do undergo high heat industrial processing that generates some oxidized compounds during manufacture. The quantities consumed at normal dietary levels are far below any documented harm threshold. The seed oil panic is a modern repackaging of the saturated fat rehabilitation movement, which itself overcorrected after decades of anti-fat messaging drove everyone to sugar. Replacing seed oils with large quantities of coconut oil or butter, the most common alternative recommendation circulating online, simply trades one set of potential imbalances for another. Canola oil is not a bioweapon with a pleasant pore spout. The real issue is the overall dietary pattern, not one ingredient on a label you've been taught to fear. If your entire diet is ultra-processed food, the specific oil used to make it is the least interesting problem on the ingredient list. 7. Raw milk is presented to you as a living superfood, a primal, unaltered food containing enzymes, beneficial bacteria, and properties that pasteurization systematically destroys, leaving behind a nutritionally diminished product that causes the allergies and digestive issues raw milk would supposedly heal. Raw milk is a real food product with real advocates and a real outbreak record. The therapeutic claims are wildly disproportionate to the clinical evidence. The CDC documents hundreds of raw milk-associated illness outbreaks annually in the United States caused by Salmonella, E. coli 0157, H7, Listeria, and Campylobacter, pathogens that pasteurization reliably eliminates. The enzymes in raw milk, primarily lipase and lactase, are largely denatured by stomach acid before they reach the small intestine, making the entire enzyme preservation argument functionally irrelevant to how your digestion actually works. Lactose intolerance is caused by a deficiency of the human enzyme lactase, not by the pasteurization process. Raw milk contains roughly the same lactose content as pasteurized milk. It does not supply your body with the enzyme it lacks. Some observational studies in European farming communities do suggest children raised on farms with raw milk exposure show lower allergy rates. But researchers attribute this to broad microbial farm exposure, not to the milk specifically. Pasteurization does marginally reduce some heat-sensitive vitamins like B12 and vitamin C, But these losses are nutritionally inconsequential, particularly given how little vitamin C milk contains to begin with. The phrase living food borrows scientific-sounding vocabulary to imply a benefit that has not been substantiated in controlled human trials. You are gambling with a documented pathogen risk in exchange for enzyme benefits that your stomach acid destroys anyway. The living part of raw milk includes bacteria that can hospitalize a child. That is not a superfood. That is a liability with a pastoral aesthetic. 8. If it's plant-based, the health math is automatic. Better. No saturated fat, no cholesterol, no animals. The packaging uses words like clean and pure and features earthy color palettes with green typography. Whatever's inside must be nutritionally superior by definition. Many commercial plant-based meat products are among the most heavily processed foods in the grocery store, and their origin story does not change that. A popular plant-based burger patty can contain upwards of 18 to 22 separate ingredients, including methyl cellulose, an industrial thickener, refined coconut oil, modified food starches, and flavor compounds engineered in a laboratory specifically to simulate blood and charred meat. Sodium content in plant-based meat products frequently exceeds 400 to 600 milligrams per serving, often higher than the conventional meat equivalent. Because palatability without animal fat requires significant salt compensation. The protein bioavailability of plant-based meat, typically derived from soy or pea protein isolate, is slightly lower than animal protein due to differences in amino acid completeness and digestibility scores. Several brands market their products as heart healthy while their saturated fat content from coconut oil rivals conventional ground beef, and the product simultaneously lacks the micronutrients naturally present in beef, B12, zinc, and heme iron. The Nova Food classification system, developed by nutrition researchers at the University of São Paulo, categorizes commercial plant-based meats as ultra-processed foods. The same classification applied to hot dogs and packaged snack cakes. Environmental benefits of plant-based meats are real and measurable. Nutritional benefit requires scrutiny of the actual label rather than the marketing language on the front of the package. Plant-based is a raw material story, not a nutritional guarantee. The packaging is telling you where the ingredients started. The ingredient list is telling you what happened to them after that. 9. Spinach equals iron. This is presented as foundational nutritional literacy, reinforced by generations of animated characters, school lunch programs, and health educators who delivered this fact with the confidence of settled science. The reputation is built partly on a decimal point error made in the 1800s that was never fully corrected, and partly on a form of iron your body can barely absorb. German chemist Erich von Wolff recorded the iron content of spinach in 1870. During transcription, a decimal point was misplaced, overstating the iron content by a factor of 10. The error circulated in scientific literature for decades before anyone caught it, and by then the cultural association had calcified. Spinach does contain iron, approximately 2.7 milligrams per 100 grams cooked. However, this is non-heme iron, the plant form, which has a bioavailability of roughly 1 to 15% compared to heme iron from animal sources at 15 to 35%. Spinach is also high in oxalates, naturally occurring compounds that bind to iron and calcium in the gut and further reduce their absorption significantly. Vitamin C consumed alongside non-heme iron can enhance its absorption, and spinach does contain vitamin C, but also the same oxalates that partially offset this benefit. Red meat, organ meats, particularly liver, clams, and oysters, contain dramatically more bioavailable iron per serving than spinach, and without the absorption-blocking compounds. Fortified cereals, lentils, and tofu are far more practical plant-based iron sources than spinach. Yet spinach remains the cultural symbol of iron nutrition because a retracted decimal error in the 19th century was more memorable than its correction. A century-old math mistake is still running your nutritional decision-making. You are eating a vegetable high in a mineral your body largely cannot access from it. The spinach is fine. The mythology around it is the problem, 10. Activated charcoal showed up in wellness culture as a photogenic detoxification agent, turning lattes black, lemonades black, ice cream black. Marketed as a substance that pulls toxins from your body and purifies your gut from the inside out. Activated charcoal does detox, just not the way the wellness industry describes, and simultaneously doing something the black latte industry never mentions. Activated charcoal is a legitimate medical tool used in poison control and emergency medicine to adsorb specific ingested toxins before they enter the bloodstream. This application is real and well established. The mechanism is non-selective adsorption. The charcoal binds to substances in the gut without discrimination. This is precisely what makes it dangerous as a casual daily supplement. Activated charcoal binds to prescription medications and reduces their plasma concentration significantly. Birth control pills, antidepressants, heart medications, and antiretroviral drugs all lose efficacy when consumed near activated charcoal. It binds to vitamins and minerals from food consumed around the same time, actively reducing nutritional absorption, the opposite of what any product marketed as a health supplement should do. The toxins it supposedly removes in wellness applications are never specified because they do not exist as a definable category your body has failed to manage. Your liver and kidneys are already handling actual metabolic waste with biochemical precision that no charcoal powder can replicate or assist. The FDA does not regulate activated charcoal as a food additive, meaning its inclusion in consumer food products exists in a legal gray zone, while its health claims remain completely unsupported by clinical research. You paid extra for a drink that may be actively reducing the effectiveness of your prescription medication in exchange for removing toxins nobody can name. Activated charcoal is a legitimate medical tool being used as a garnish. These are not compatible roles. 11. A bowl of granola in the morning reads as responsible. It is oats, some nuts, a drizzle of honey. What people who make considered decisions have for breakfast. It comes in a bag with mountain photography and typography that implies restraint. Most commercial granola is calorie-dense, sugar-heavy, and nutritionally comparable to eating a moderate portion of dessert before 9 in the morning. A typical half-cup serving of commercial granola, the portion listed on the label, which is not the portion most people actually pour, contains 200 to 300 calories, 8 to 15 grams of sugar, and 6 to 14 grams of fat. Most people pour 2 to 3 times this amount without consulting the label. Granola was invented by John Harvey Kellogg in the 1890s as a health reform food, but commercial versions have drifted dramatically from any functional health origin since then. The binding agent that creates the cluster texture people find most appealing is typically a combination of sugar, honey, and refined oil baked at high heat until caramelized. The glycemic impact of most commercial granola is significant because the oats are pre-processed, and the sugar content drives blood glucose upward rapidly, particularly in granola consumed without substantial accompanying fat or protein to slow absorption. Products marketed as low sugar or protein granola frequently substitute sugar alcohols, which cause gastrointestinal distress in sensitive individuals, or add protein isolates that barely offset the caloric density of the base product. Compared to an equivalent serving of plain rolled oats, commercial granola provides fewer whole food nutrients, more sugar, more calories, and more fat at a dramatically higher price per serving. The mountain on the packaging is doing an enormous amount of nutritional heavy lifting. What is inside is largely a baked sugar cluster with exceptional brand photography. You could eat a cookie with your coffee and arrive at approximately the same place with considerably less self-congratulation. 12. Kombucha is probiotic, and probiotic means gut health, and gut health means everything, so a daily kombucha solves everything. The label says live cultures. Cultures are science. The logic seems airtight until you ask whether those cultures actually survive to your gut, colonize it, or fix anything specifically, at which point the conversation becomes considerably more complicated. Kombucha is produced through fermentation involving a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, creating a mildly acidic beverage with live bacterial strains, primarily Gluconobacter and Lactobacillus species. Probiotic bacteria must survive stomach acid, which has a pH of 1.5 to 3.5, to reach the intestines with viable cell counts. Most kombucha strains have not been tested for survival through gastric passage in human clinical trials. The human gut microbiome contains trillions of bacteria across hundreds of species. The number of live organisms in a bottle of commercial kombucha, even at 1 billion CFU per serving, represents a small fraction of daily microbiome fluctuation in a healthy individual. Randomized controlled trials specifically examining kombucha's effect on human gut health outcomes are essentially absent from peer-reviewed literature. What exists is encouraging preliminary work, not established clinical evidence. Commercial kombucha frequently contains 8 to 15 grams of sugar per bottle, which feeds gut bacteria, including opportunistic strains. These show in ways that are not always discussed alongside the probiotic claims. The gut microbiome literature broadly supports dietary fiber diversity and fermented food variety as the strongest modifiable factors for microbiome health. Not any single beverage consumed daily as a ritual. Kombucha might genuinely help. It might also just be fizzy vinegar. The science has not settled the question, and the marketing settled it years ago on the science's behalf. Those are different things. 13. Olive oil has a low smoke point. Everyone knows this. You should only use it raw in cold dressings at room temperature. Cook with it, and you have created toxic compounds that destroy the health benefits you paid a premium price to obtain. This is how the story travels. Olive oil's actual smoke point is higher than commonly claimed, and smoke point is the wrong metric for evaluating cooking safety in the first place. Extra virgin olive oil has a smoke point of approximately 375 to 405 degrees Fahrenheit, well above typical stovetop sautéing temperatures of 250 to 350 degrees and sufficient for the vast majority of home cooking tasks. The compounds that make extra virgin olive oil protective, primarily oleocanthal, hydroxytyrosol, and polyphenols, nenpurpose, are antioxidants that partially protect the oil itself from oxidative degradation during heating. A 2018 study published in Acte Scientific Nutritional Health tested multiple cooking oils head-to-head and found that extra virgin olive oil produced significantly fewer harmful polar compounds and oxidation byproducts than many seed oils with substantially higher smoke points. Smoke point correlates with the temperature at which an oil visibly smokes, but does not correlate with the rate of oxidation or the production of harmful aldehydes, a more meaningful and more honest measure of cooking safety. Refined olive oil, which is distinct from extra virgin, has a smoke point above 450 degrees Fahrenheit and is entirely suitable for high heat applications including frying. The persistent low smoke point myth benefits the refined seed oil industry, which has every commercial incentive for you to choose their cheaper product over the more expensive extra virgin alternative. You moved your olive oil to the salad shelf based on a number that doesn't measure what you assumed it measured. Mediterranean cooking has used this oil over heat for thousands of years. The toxic compound narrative arrived considerably more recently. 14. Oatmeal is healthy, heart healthy, fiber rich, and low glycemic. This has been told to you with enough frequency that it has the texture of fact. You buy the convenient single-serve flavored packets because the logic transfers. You're eating oatmeal, so the benefit transfers with it. It does not. The glycemic index of oat products varies dramatically based on processing level, and instant flavored oatmeal is nutritionally closer to a sweetened breakfast cereal than to a blood sugar stable morning meal. Steel-cut oats have a glycemic index of approximately 55, digesting slowly due to intact grain structure and dense, soluble fiber content. Rolled oats, old-fashioned oats, have a glycemic index of approximately 57 to 66, already higher because steaming and flattening during processing increases surface area for digestive enzyme access. Instant oats, which are pre-cooked, dried, and rolled to near powder thinness, have a glycemic index of approximately 83, comparable to white bread, because the grain structure has been mechanically and thermally pre-digested to near completion before it reaches your bowl. Flavored instant oatmeal packets add 10 to 15 grams of sugar per serving on top of the already high base glycemic index, creating a glucose response equivalent to several forms of candy that nobody would consider a responsible breakfast. Beta-glucan, the soluble fiber that gives oats their cardiovascular credentials, is present in instant oats, but the processing reduces its viscosity. The specific property that slows gastric emptying and moderates blood glucose response. The American Heart Association certification that appears on some instant oatmeal products is awarded based on fat and sodium thresholds, not glycemic behavior. You traded the actual blood sugar benefit of oatmeal for the emotional benefit of eating something called oatmeal. Processing level is the entire variable. The packet with the pastoral imagery is not the same product as the bulk bin. 15 multigrain sounds better than single grain. More grains, more nutrients, more nutritional sophistication. The packaging features rustic imagery and earthy tones that communicate wholesomeness at a glance. You selected the multigrain option and registered it as the responsible choice. Multigrain means a product contains multiple grains. It says nothing about whether those grains are whole or refined, and the difference between those two things is the entire nutritional story. Multigrain is a descriptor of variety, not structure. A multigrain bread can contain refined flour from 5 different grains, all of them stripped of their bran and germ during milling, and legally carry the multigrain label without any obligation to inform you. Whole grain means the entire kernel is preserved. The bran, the germ, and the endosperm. This is where the fiber, the B vitamins, and the mineral content reside. Refined grain products have the bran and germ removed, leaving the starchy endosperm, which is where the calories live and where the nutritional complexity does not. The FDA allows bread to be labeled multigrain even when the primary ingredient by weight is enriched white flour, with minority grain varieties added in small quantities purely for label eligibility. Visual indicators, brown color, visible seeds, dense texture, do not reliably indicate whole grain content because caramel color and added seeds can create this appearance in a product that is primarily refined flour with better styling. The actual indicator is the ingredient list. Whole wheat flour or whole followed by any grain name must appear first by weight for the product to meaningfully deliver whole grain nutrition. A consumer audit of popular bread brands found a significant percentage of products labeled multigrain, grain, or harvest had enriched flour as the primary ingredient. You bought a bread with a lot happening visually and very little happening nutritionally. The front label is marketing. The ingredient list is the truth. 16. After training, you need protein, and protein bars are protein, and protein bars are therefore the post-workout solution. They are in the fitness section. Athletes endorse them. The math appears functional. Most commercial protein bars are candy bars that have been introduced to a scoop of protein powder and given a gym membership they do not actually use. The average popular protein bar contains 20 to 30 grams of protein alongside 20 to 35 grams of sugar, or sugar alcohols, 10 to 20 grams of fat, and 250 to 400 calories. A nutritional profile nearly identical to a premium chocolate-covered candy bar with a protein additive and a sport-adjacent label. Sugar alcohols, erythritol, maltitol, sorbitol, used in low-sugar bar variants, are partially absorbed in the small intestine and fermented by gut bacteria, causing bloating, cramping, and diarrhea at moderate consumption levels, particularly in individuals with any digestive sensitivity. Many protein bar protein sources are soy protein isolate or collagen peptides, which lack the complete leucine content needed to optimally stimulate muscle protein synthesis compared to whey or egg protein. The protein quality, digestibility, corrected amino acid score of mixed protein bars varies significantly, and not all protein grams listed on a label represent equal anabolic value. Marketing compliance from the FDA is minimal. A bar can claim to be a performance or fitness product with no regulatory standard behind either of those terms. A 200-calorie serving of Greek yogurt or 3 eggs delivers equivalent or superior protein with more bioavailable amino acids and no additives at a fraction of the cost. If you remove the protein powder and the action photography from the packaging, you would be holding a chocolate-covered sugar rectangle. The gym context is a costume. Read what is in it before calling it recovery. 17. Every child learns this with complete conviction. You swallowed gum and now it is going to sit in your stomach for 7 years because your body cannot digest it. This fact travels between generations with alarming confidence and zero scrutiny. Your body cannot fully digest gum base, this part is true. What your body does with indigestible material, however, is not quarantine it. Chewing gum contains two main components: the soluble ingredients, sweeteners, softeners, and flavorings, which dissolve and absorb through normal digestion, and the gum base, resins, elastomers, and waxes, which is genuinely indigestible. Indigestible material does not park itself in the stomach. Gastrointestinal motility. The muscular contractions that propel all contents through the digestive tract moves gum base through the system within approximately 40 to 72 hours, the same general transit timeline as other dietary fiber. Gastroenterologists classify gum base as fiber adjacent in terms of transit behavior. It passes through the system unchanged and exits without ceremony. This is identical to how cellulose from vegetables moves through. Case reports of gastric bezoars, impacted masses, from gum do exist, but these involve children consuming large amounts of gum daily over prolonged periods, an edge case that is not a standard outcome of swallowing a single piece. A pediatric gastroenterologist writing in the journal Gastroenterology and Hepatology explicitly characterized the 7-year claim as a medical myth with no support in gastrointestinal physiology. The persistence of this myth reflects how effectively childhood information sticks, particularly when delivered with parental authority and mild horror during a moment of minor rule breaking. Your stomach is not a gum museum cataloging every piece you swallowed since childhood. The 7-year sentence was a deterrent invented by adults who were tired of picking gum off furniture. It worked perfectly. It was entirely false. 18. Cold water during or after meals is dangerous. It solidifies the fats in your meal, arrests digestion, creates blockages, and should be replaced with warm or room temperature water if you take your health seriously. Your core body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it will not be meaningfully disturbed by a glass of cold water. The human digestive system maintains a core temperature regulated by metabolic processes, blood circulation, and the hypothalamus. Cold water consumed in normal amounts is warmed within seconds of contact with the stomach lining. The thermal capacity of that volume of water is trivially small relative to the metabolic heat your body continuously generates. Dietary fats do not solidify in the digestive tract under normal conditions because the body maintains the internal thermal environment required for enzymatic fat emulsification and absorption, regardless of what temperature your beverage arrives at. Bile, the digestive fluid that emulsifies fats, is produced by the liver and stored in the gallbladder. Its release and activity are triggered by fat presence in the duodenum, not by meal temperature or beverage temperature. The cold water digestion myth is particularly common in traditional Chinese medicine-adjacent wellness spaces and certain South Asian health traditions, where it represents a folk caution rather than a physiological fact. Cold water consumption has been studied for its thermogenic effect. The body does burn a small number of calories warming ingested water to body temperature. This is real. The number is approximately 8 to 9 calories per 500 milliliters, which is not a meaningful metabolic event in any direction. There is no peer-reviewed gastroenterology research supporting impaired digestion from cold water consumption in healthy individuals. Your stomach is a 98-degree enzymatic processing chamber that has managed temperature fluctuations since the first humans drank from cold streams. The freeze risk does not exist. 19. Skip a meal and your body panics. Metabolism crashes. Fat hoards itself defensively. Muscle disappears before your body acknowledges the fat stores sitting right there. Your physiology cannot distinguish between a missed lunch and a genuine famine, so it immediately enters self-preservation lockdown. Metabolic adaptation from food restriction is real, but it requires days to weeks of significant caloric deficit, not the span of a single skipped meal. Adaptive thermogenesis, the metabolic slowdown that occurs in response to prolonged caloric restriction, is a documented physiological phenomenon studied extensively in weight loss and starvation research. Research on complete fasting shows that resting metabolic rate actually increases slightly during the first 24 to 36 hours due to elevated norepinephrine, which is the body's response to mobilizing stored fuel, not a shutdown response. A landmark study tracking metabolic function during prolonged starvation found that significant lean mass catabolism does not become the primary fuel source until glycogen depletion and substantial ketosis are already well established. A timeline measured in days, not skipped meals. The starvation mode framing was amplified by diet culture to sell the concept of frequent small meals, a recommendation that serves the snack and supplement industries far more than the available evidence supported. A single meal omission in a person with adequate body fat stores triggers a normal hormonal response. Glucagon rises, insulin falls, and fat oxidation increases. This is adaptive metabolism functioning correctly, not an emergency. Genuine metabolic adaptation to starvation is observed in long-term caloric restriction of 30 to 40% below baseline, maintained over extended periods. Not a skipped Wednesday lunch while you were in back-to-back meetings. Your metabolism did not initiate emergency protocols. It has evolved to manage intermittent fuel gaps across millions of years. You are not a machine that breaks if you miss a scheduled refuel. 20. Fruit must be eaten alone on an empty stomach and never directly after a meal. Otherwise, it ferments, rots, and creates toxic byproducts that poison your gut from within. This is the food combining rule, delivered with the conviction of someone who has studied physiology and the track record of someone who has not. Fruit does not rot in your stomach. Your stomach is not a composting environment, and the conditions required for fermentation are not present there. Food combining theory originated with Herbert Shelton in the 1920s, a naturopath with no medical degree who argued that different foods require incompatible digestive conditions and must never be consumed together. The stomach's pH of 1.5 to 3.5 creates an environment actively hostile to fermentation. The microorganisms required for fermentation, yeast, and certain bacteria, cannot survive or function at this acidity level. Gastric transit time varies by meal composition, but averages 2 to 5 hours for mixed meals. Food does not remain in the stomach long enough to undergo meaningful fermentation, regardless of what sequence it arrived in. Fruit contains fructose, glucose, and fiber, all handled by standard digestive processes, regardless of what was consumed beforehand or what will be consumed afterward. The intestinal microbiome does ferment certain carbohydrates in the colon. This is a normal and genuinely healthy process that produces short-chain fatty acids your cells use as fuel. This is not rotting. This is symbiotic function that your body depends on. No controlled clinical study has demonstrated measurable negative outcomes from eating fruit at any particular time relative to other foods in people with functional digestive systems. Food combining theory was invented without scientific credentials and has spent a century generating unnecessary mealtime anxiety. Eat the fruit whenever you want it. The sequencing is not the issue. 21. Bone broth is ancient medicine. It heals leaky gut, regenerates cartilage, rebuilds damaged joints, and addresses conditions that modern medicine manages only with expensive interventions. Grandmothers knew something about collagen that contemporary research is only beginning to appreciate. Bone broth is a nutritious food with a therapeutic reputation significantly larger than its clinical evidence supports. Bone broth does contain collagen, gelatin, glycine, proline, and minerals, all legitimate nutrients present in real quantities. It is not a nutritionally empty product. The specific claim that consuming collagen repairs cartilage is based on a misunderstanding of how protein digestion works. Collagen consumed orally is broken into individual amino acids during digestion, which then enter the general amino acid pool and are directed by the body according to its own priorities. They are not chaperoned specifically to your joints. Gelatin does support gut lining integrity in animal models. Human trials on bone broth specifically for intestinal permeability, frequently described as leaky gut, are extremely limited, underpowered, and have not been replicated at scale. The term leaky gut as a standalone clinical diagnosis does not exist in mainstream gastroenterology. Intestinal permeability is a real phenomenon in specific documented conditions, including celiac disease and Crohn's disease, but it is not a general population diagnosis that a warm broth addresses. Collagen peptide supplements, hydrolyzed collagen, have modestly more supportive evidence for skin elasticity and joint discomfort than bone broth itself, though effect sizes in those trials are generally small. The commercial bone broth market has no regulatory standard for collagen content, meaning product quality varies enormously between brands making identical claims. Bone broth is a warm, nourishing, protein-adjacent food. It is not a prescription. The packaging is simply hoping you cannot tell the difference between those two things. 22. Fat is bad, whole milk has fat, and skim milk has none of it. Therefore, skim milk is healthier. This logic ran the dairy aisle for decades and produced generations of people drinking thin, chalky milk while registering it as an act of nutritional responsibility. The relationship between dairy fat and health outcomes is far more complex than the skim milk recommendation acknowledged, and recent research has substantially complicated the old hierarchy. The dietary fat and heart disease hypothesis that drove low-fat dairy recommendations was largely built on Anshel Keys' 7 countries study, which has since been criticized extensively for selecting data from countries that supported his hypothesis while excluding countries that did not. Full-fat dairy contains conjugated linoleic acid and vitamin K2, bioactive compounds with potentially protective cardiovascular effects that are largely absent from skim milk. Fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K in milk require fat for absorption. Skim milk is lower in these vitamins unless artificially fortified, and the fortified fat-soluble vitamins absorb less efficiently without the fat matrix that would normally carry them. Multiple large prospective cohort studies, including analysis from the European Prospective Investigation into Cancer and Nutrition, found no significant association between full-fat dairy consumption and increased cardiovascular risk. Skim milk has a higher glycemic index than whole milk because removing fat increases the proportional lactose content per serving and eliminates the fat that would otherwise slow glucose absorption into the bloodstream. Observational data from several studies suggest that full-fat dairy consumers have lower rates of obesity than skim milk consumers. A counterintuitive finding that researchers attribute largely to differences in satiety between the two products. You have been drinking a nutritionally stripped version of a food to avoid a nutrient that may not have been the problem to begin with, while simultaneously making its sugar more rapidly available. The low-fat gospel was a hypothesis. The evidence has since complicated it considerably. 23. Rice cakes are nothing. Air and pressed rice, nearly 0 calories, and certainly 0 guilt. Dieters across the 1980s and 90s made them a symbol of controlled, disciplined eating, and the reputation has not fully recovered from the truth. Rice cakes are pure refined carbohydrate with essentially no fiber, no protein, and no fat, delivering a glycemic index higher than many foods people assume are obviously less healthy. Plain rice cakes have a glycemic index of approximately 82 to 87, higher than white bread, which scores around 75, and higher than regular table sugar, which is sucrose at a glycemic index of approximately 65. The elevated glycemic index exists because rice cakes are made from puffed refined rice with no accompanying fiber, fat, or protein to slow gastric emptying or blunt the glucose response in any way. A typical rice cake contains 35 to 50 calories. The satiety provided by this caloric amount is negligible, which means consumption almost invariably leads to additional eating within a short window, frequently erasing any caloric benefit the original choice was meant to deliver. Flavored rice cake varieties, caramel, chocolate, white cheddar, add sugar and fat without adding meaningful fiber or protein, making them a low-fiber snack with a modest caloric discount relative to crackers and a worse glycemic profile than either. The blood sugar spike followed by the corresponding insulin response and subsequent glucose drop creates a hunger cycle that leads many people toward more total caloric consumption over the course of a day, not less. Rice cakes have no documented advantage over other snack options in controlled weight management trials. The diet food designation is based entirely on low calorie count and light texture rather than any measurable metabolic benefit. You chose a snack based on how appropriately punished it made you feel. The glycemic impact was not a reasonable trade for the suffering. 24, fresh is best, frozen is acceptable, and canned is a nutritional wasteland, overcooked, preserved in chemicals, and stripped of any meaningful vitamin content by the time it reaches you. Anyone serious about nutrition avoids canned vegetables as a matter of principle. Canning preserves most nutrients effectively, and in specific cases, canned vegetables outperform their fresh counterparts in ways the fresh-only ideology does not account for. The canning process does degrade heat-sensitive vitamins, particularly vitamin C and some B vitamins. But this loss occurs during the initial high-heat sterilization phase, after which nutrients stabilize in the sealed oxygen-free environment for the duration of storage. Minerals, including iron, calcium, potassium, and magnesium, are essentially unaffected by canning because they are heat-stable elements that do not degrade under thermal processing. Lycopene, the carotenoid antioxidant in tomatoes associated with cardiovascular and prostate health, is actually more bioavailable from canned tomatoes than from fresh ones, because heat processing breaks down the cell walls that restrict access to this compound in its raw state. A study comparing fresh, frozen, and canned produce, published in the Journal of the Science of Food and Agriculture, found canned vegetables were nutritionally comparable to fresh across most parameters tested. Fresh vegetables lose nutrients progressively from the moment of harvest through transport, extended retail storage, and however many days they spend in your refrigerator. A canned vegetable preserves nutrients at the time of processing and holds them there. Low-sodium canned vegetables in particular offer an affordable, accessible, shelf-stable nutrient source that meaningfully improves diet quality for people without consistent access to fresh produce markets. Fresh vegetables from a garden that morning are exceptional. Fresh vegetables that spent 3 weeks in transit and another week in your crisper drawer are not obviously superior to their canned equivalent. Canned is not a consolation prize, it is a legitimate option. 25. The swap is automatic and unquestioned. White potato out, sweet potato in. White potatoes are empty carbs carrying cultural baggage. Sweet potatoes are superfoods. This is the standard nutritional calculus delivered with the confidence of someone who has not looked at what white potatoes actually contain. Sweet potatoes have a genuinely impressive nutritional profile, so do white potatoes. The infinitely superior framing omits the complications on both sides of the comparison. Sweet potatoes are rich in beta-carotene, the provitamin A precursor, which white potatoes lack entirely. This is a meaningful nutritional advantage, particularly for populations with inadequate vitamin A intake. White potatoes contain significantly more potassium per serving than sweet potatoes, approximately 920 milligrams versus 438 milligrams per medium potato, making them one of the most potassium-dense foods available in the produce section. White potatoes have higher levels of resistant starch, particularly after cooking and cooling, which feeds beneficial gut bacteria and produces a lower glycemic impact than freshly cooked hot potato starch. The glycemic index of sweet potatoes varies dramatically by preparation. A baked sweet potato can reach a glycemic index of 94, while a boiled white potato averages 78. The lower glycemic assumption for sweet potatoes is preparation dependent and is frequently reversed when you compare equivalent cooking methods. Both potatoes are naturally fat-free, relatively low in calories when prepared without added fats, and provide meaningful amounts of vitamin C, B6, and manganese. The white potato's poor nutritional reputation stems almost entirely from how it is most commonly prepared, fried, buried in cheese and cream, or processed into chips, not from the potato's actual nutrient composition. The vegetable is not responsible for what you pour on it. Sweet potatoes are genuinely nutritious. White potatoes are also genuinely nutritious. The hierarchy was built on preparation habits, not on the potatoes themselves. 26 Viral Content declared tilapia to be a fake, lab-engineered, nutritionally worthless fish. Worse than bacon fed on waste, mutated beyond recognition by industrial aquaculture. People abandoned the most affordable fish in most grocery stores based on a forwarded message, and the fish has been fighting a reputation it did not earn since. Tilapia is a real fish with real nutritional value and a viral misinformation problem. The worse than bacon claim originated from a 2008 Wake Forest University study that noted tilapia's low omega-3 to omega-6 ratio and elevated arachidonic acid content. Media outlets sensationalized this narrow finding into a headline suggesting the fish was actively harmful, which is not what the researchers concluded. Tilapia does have a poor omega-3 profile compared to fatty fish like salmon or mackerel. This is accurate. It is also a high-quality, low-calorie protein source, providing approximately 26 grams of protein per 100 grams at roughly 128 calories with minimal fat. Farmed tilapia is typically fed commercially produced pellets of soy, corn, and grain, not feces as viral content frequently and vividly claimed. The waste feeding story applies to some operations in specific regions and is not representative of standard commercial production. The arachidonic acid concern assumes dietary arachidonic acid directly translates to inflammatory outcomes in humans, a relationship that is substantially more complex and context-dependent in actual human metabolism than the viral posts suggested. Tilapia's genuine nutritional shortcoming is specifically its fat profile. This is easily addressed by eating it alongside vegetables prepared in olive oil or consuming other omega-3 rich foods elsewhere in the diet. It remains one of the most widely farmed and consumed fish globally, accessible at price points that make quality protein available to people priced out of salmon. A forwarded email declared it nutritionally extinct. The fish disagreed. 27 White meat is the responsible choice, and dark turkey meat is something you take apologetically, aware that you have chosen flavor over health and hoping nobody noticed. People carve the breast with visible pride and take the thigh with the quiet admission of dietary failure. Dark turkey meat has more fat than white meat, and it also has more of several nutrients that white meat largely lacks, a trade-off that the hierarchy ignores entirely. Dark turkey meat, thigh, and drumstick has approximately 2 to 4 more grams of fat per 100 grams than breast meat. The majority of this fat is unsaturated, primarily monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fatty acids, not the saturated variety that drove the original concern. Dark meat contains significantly higher concentrations of zinc, selenium, riboflavin, niacin, B12, and iron than white breast meat, all nutrients involved in immune function, energy metabolism, and oxygen transport throughout the body. Myoglobin, the oxygen-storing protein that gives dark meat its deeper color and contributes to its iron content, is essentially absent in white meat, which accounts for the most meaningful nutritional difference between the two. The caloric difference between dark and white turkey meat is modest, approximately 130 to 140 calories per 100 grams for white versus 160 to 180 for dark, skinless. This gap narrows further when realistic portion sizes are accounted for rather than laboratory weights. The perception of dark meat as unhealthy frequently conflates the meat itself with common preparation methods: deep frying, leaving skin intact, and applying heavy saucing, that are applied to dark cuts more often than to breast meat. Skin-removed dark turkey meat consumed in reasonable portions is a nutritionally dense choice, not a compromise. You have been taking the thigh home like it carries a moral failing while leaving the zinc and iron on the serving platter for someone less principled. 28. Honey is natural, and natural sugar behaves differently from refined sugar. Raw honey is unprocessed, enzymatically alive, and absorbed by the body in a way that spares your blood sugar, the spike associated with industrial sweeteners. Nature, in this framing, is smarter than processing. Honey is approximately 80% sugar by weight. Nature's production method did not meaningfully alter its fundamental metabolic behavior once it reaches your bloodstream. Raw honey contains approximately 30 to 35% glucose and 40 to 45% fructose, with small amounts of water, enzymes, pollen, and trace minerals. This sugar composition is largely equivalent to the ratio found in table sugar and high fructose corn syrup. The glycemic index of raw honey ranges from approximately 45 to 64, depending on floral source and fructose to glucose ratio. Lower than pure glucose, but still a meaningful blood glucose trigger, particularly for anyone managing diabetes or insulin resistance. The enzymes in raw honey, primarily diastase, invertase, and glucose oxidase, are involved in honey's antimicrobial properties. They have no metabolic role relevant to blood sugar regulation in the person consuming the honey. Antioxidants and polyphenols in raw honey are real and present in small quantities, and research does suggest modest anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. These documented benefits do not counteract the glucose response in any clinically meaningful way. Diabetic patients and individuals with insulin resistance who substitute honey for refined sugar based on its natural status frequently show glucose excursions comparable to equivalent doses of refined sugar. Raw honey does have legitimate therapeutic applications: wound healing, some evidence for cough suppression in children, antimicrobial properties in topical use, that are separate from and unrelated to the blood sugar claim. Your blood does not pause to appreciate the artisanal origin of the sugar arriving in it. Raw honey is better than refined sugar in some ways. Not raising your blood glucose is not one of them. 29. Shrimp is high in cholesterol. Lobster is high in cholesterol. Dietary cholesterol raises blood cholesterol. Therefore, people with any cardiovascular concern avoid shellfish entirely and eat their chicken breast in quiet resignation, while the seafood platter circulates past them at every family event. The dietary cholesterol to blood cholesterol relationship is far weaker than decades of nutritional guidance suggested, and shellfish has largely been cleared of the charges. The 2015 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee removed the long-standing 300 mg daily cholesterol limit recommendation, explicitly stating that cholesterol is not a nutrient of concern for overconsumption, a statement that represented a significant reversal of decades of the official dietary guidance. The liver produces approximately 75 to 80% of the body's cholesterol endogenously. When dietary cholesterol intake increases, the liver downregulates its own production in a homeostatic compensation process that limits net change in blood cholesterol for the majority of people. Approximately 75% of the population are cholesterol hyporesponders. Their blood cholesterol changes minimally in response to dietary cholesterol intake. Roughly 25% are hyperresponders who do show a measurable response, though in these individuals, HDL and LDL often rise proportionally, maintaining the ratio that cardiovascular researchers consider more clinically relevant. Shrimp is very low in saturated fat, approximately 0.3 grams per 100 grams. Saturated fat has a substantially stronger and more consistent effect on LDL cholesterol than dietary cholesterol itself, which is the variable that actually deserved the regulatory attention it never fully received. A study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, specifically examining shrimp consumption, found it raised LDL modestly, but raised HDL more substantially, with no net increase in cardiovascular risk markers. The restriction of shellfish in heart-healthy diets reflects an older paradigm. The science updated its position. The catering industry did not send a correction. Eat the shrimp. 30. Cast iron cookware leaches iron into food, and cooking in cast iron therefore supplements your dietary iron intake, potentially addressing or preventing iron deficiency. Some people have upgraded their cookware specifically as a nutritional strategy. Cast iron does leach iron into food. This part is real and measurable. The form, the amount, and the bioavailability of that iron make it a marginal contributor that does not perform the function people are attributing to it. Iron leaching from cast iron is real. A study published in the Journal of the American Dietetic Association found that cooking acidic foods like tomato sauce in cast iron increase the iron content of the food significantly. The type of iron that leaches, however, is elemental iron, a non-heme form with substantially lower bioavailability than the heme iron from meat sources or even the iron from fortified foods specifically designed for absorption. The quantity of iron transferred depends on the acidity of the food, the cooking time, and the age and seasoning condition of the pan. A well-seasoned cast iron pan releases considerably less iron than a new or poorly maintained one, meaning the supplementation effect decreases as the pan improves in its primary cooking function. The therapeutic iron dose required to address documented iron deficiency anemia, typically 150 to 200 milligrams of elemental iron daily in standard treatment protocols, is orders of magnitude greater than what any realistic cast iron cooking routine provides. Cooking in cast iron is not a substitute for a medical diagnosis and an appropriate treatment protocol. Clinical iron deficiency requires supplementation under medical guidance, potentially combined with dietary changes toward higher bioavailability sources, not a cookware recommendation. Non-acidic foods cooked briefly in cast iron absorb a negligible additional iron. Your pan is not a pharmacy, it is a pan and a very good one, and those are sufficient qualifications for a piece of cookware. 31. Coconut sugar is unrefined, natural, and low glycemic. It is absorbed slowly, does not provoke the same insulin response as table sugar, and provides trace minerals that refined sugar lacks entirely. It is the sweetener you reach for without guilt. Coconut sugar is primarily sucrose, approximately 70 to 80%. The identical disaccharide found in cane sugar, composed of equal parts glucose and fructose. It is metabolized the same way because it is chemically the same thing with a different origin story. The glycemic index of coconut sugar has been cited as 35 in a single study from the Philippines Food and Nutrition Research Institute. This figure has not been independently replicated, and most nutrition researchers view it with considerable skepticism given the product's known sucrose composition. For reference, the glycemic index of regular table sugar is approximately 65. If coconut sugar's glycemic index were genuinely 35, this would require a metabolic mechanism that has not been identified or explained by the product's known chemistry. Coconut sugar does contain small amounts of minerals, iron, zinc, calcium, potassium, and inulin fiber. These are present in quantities so minimal per realistic serving that they constitute no meaningful nutritional contribution to your daily intake. The inulin content cited as the mechanism behind the supposed lower glycemic response is present at roughly 1 to 3 grams per 100 grams of coconut sugar, a negligible amount relative to the sucrose content that dominates its metabolic behavior. The price premium for coconut sugar over cane sugar can be 5 to 10 times higher per weight for a product your pancreas handles identically. You are buying a story about a tropical origin and a glycemic index figure that has not survived independent verification. Coconut sugar is not a loophole. It is a boutique version of the same substance wearing a different label. 32. Miss lunch and your body panics. Your metabolism crashes, fat hoards itself protectively, and your body begins consuming its own muscle tissue before acknowledging the fat stores it has been accumulating specifically for this purpose. The fear of a single skipped meal has been deployed so effectively that it restructured how an entire generation thinks about eating frequency. Metabolic adaptation from food restriction is real. It requires days to weeks of significant caloric deficit, not the window of a missed meal. Adaptive thermogenesis, the measurable metabolic slowdown that occurs in response to prolonged caloric restriction, is documented and real. Research on complete fasting consistently shows that resting metabolic rate actually increases slightly during the first 24 to 36 hours due to elevated norepinephrine, which is the body mobilizing stored fuel rather than shutting anything down. Genuine lean mass catabolism does not become a primary fuel source until glycogen depletion and substantial ketosis are already well underway. A timeline measured in days, not in the gap between your breakfast and your dinner. The starvation mode framing was amplified by diet culture and used to market the concept of frequent small meals, a recommendation that served the snack food and supplement industries with considerably more fidelity than it served the people following it. Single meal omission in a person with adequate body fat stores triggers a predictable and functional hormonal response. Glucagon rises, insulin falls, and fat oxidation increases. This is the system working correctly. Genuine metabolic adaptation to starvation is documented in long-term caloric restriction maintained at 30 to 40% below baseline over extended periods. Not a skipped Wednesday lunch during a busy work week. Your metabolism has evolved to manage intermittent fuel gaps across millions of years of human history. It did not receive the memo that you had a meeting through lunch and interpret this as an emergency requiring immediate muscle consumption. 33. Natural flavors appears on an ingredient label and you feel a quiet reassurance. Something in those two words reads as transparent, whole food adjacent, and safe. You have been nudged toward calm by a phrase that has almost no regulatory substance behind it. Natural flavors is one of the most permissive terms on any food label, encompassing a range of processed and extracted compounds that the word natural does not meaningfully describe to a consumer. The FDA defines natural flavors as the essential oil, oleoracin, essence, extractive, protein, hydrolysate, distillate, or any product of roasting, heating, or enzymolysis which contains flavoring constituents derived from a listed natural source. This definition allows highly chemically processed compounds to carry the natural classification, provided they originated from a natural source somewhere in the extraction chain, which can be very far removed from anything resembling whole food. Natural flavors do not need to bear any resemblance to the food they are imitating in flavor or appearance. A strawberry natural flavor may be derived from wood pulp fermentation products rather than from strawberries, and the label is under no obligation to tell you this. Natural flavors is the fourth most common ingredient on food labels in the United States, yet ingredient lists are not required to specify the source, the processing method, or the compound used to achieve the flavor. The regulatory distinction between natural and artificial flavors frequently comes down to the origin of the chemical compound rather than the degree of processing applied to produce it. Artificial vanilla, vanillin from petroleum, and natural vanilla, vanillin extracted from wood pulp, are chemically identical molecules classified differently based solely on origin. Natural flavors can also include compounds derived from animal products, an issue for vegan and halal consumers who have no way of knowing from the label. Natural flavors is a legally comfortable phrase positioned at the end of a processing chain with no obligation to be visible to you. 34. Coffee dehydrates you. Do not count it toward your fluid intake, compensate for every cup with additional water, and approach it as a net negative in your daily hydration accounting. You have heard this repeated with such frequency that it has the status of settled health advice. Coffee is a mild diuretic. It is not a net fluid deficit, and multiple well-designed studies confirm it contributes positively to daily hydration rather than subtracting from it. Caffeine inhibits antidiuretic hormones slightly, increasing urine production at higher doses. This effect is dose-dependent and diminishes significantly with regular consumption as physiological tolerance develops, meaning that habitual coffee drinkers experience less diuretic effect from the same caffeine dose than occasional consumers. A study published in PLOS 1 by Killer and colleagues found no significant difference in hydration markers between men drinking 4 cups of coffee daily versus equal volumes of water over a 3-day period. A 2014 review examining caffeine as a diuretic confirmed that caffeine doses below 300 milligrams, approximately 3 standard cups of brewed coffee, showed no clinically significant diuretic effect compared to water. The European Food Safety Authority examined the evidence and concluded that coffee can contribute to daily water intake rather than working against it. The dehydrating framing likely originates from caffeine's acute diuretic effect at high doses in infrequent consumers. An acute laboratory observation that does not translate to chronic, habitual daily consumption patterns. Tea, which also contains caffeine, is similarly hydrating despite sharing the same reputation among people who apply coffee logic to all caffeinated beverages. The caffeine content in normal servings of both beverages is insufficient to exceed the fluid delivered by the beverage itself. Your morning coffee is not in an adversarial relationship with your hydration. The diuretic effect at normal consumption is considerably weaker than the wellness industry and decades of repeated conventional wisdom would prefer you to believe. 35. Cancer cells love glucose. Ketogenic diets remove glucose. Therefore, a ketogenic diet starves cancer and represents a dietary intervention the oncology establishment is slow to acknowledge. The Warburg effect is real science. The conclusion being sold from it is not. Otto Warburg observed in 1924 that many cancer cells preferentially use aerobic glycolysis, glucose fermentation, even in the presence of oxygen. This metabolic inefficiency is now understood as a consequence of genetic mutations affecting mitochondrial function, not a simple dietary variable you can override with carbohydrate restriction. Restricting dietary carbohydrates does not starve cancer cells because blood glucose levels are tightly regulated by the liver through gluconeogenesis. Even in deep ketosis, blood glucose remains at approximately 70 to 99 milligrams per deciliter, sufficient to fuel cells, including cancer cells, without interruption. Cancer cells can also metabolize ketone bodies, glutamine, fatty acids, and lactate as alternative fuel sources. They are not exclusively glucose dependent, and the pathway does not close when you remove bread from your diet. Oncology researchers studying ketogenic diets as adjunct cancer therapy describe the approach as a potential tool to enhance conventional treatment sensitivity in specific cancer types, not as a standalone cure or general preventive strategy. Several cancer types, including those driven by KRAS mutations such as pancreatic cancer, actually upregulate fat metabolism and can be metabolically stimulated rather than suppressed under ketogenic conditions, the opposite of the intended effect. Major cancer research institutions, including the American Cancer Society, do not endorse ketogenic diets as cancer treatment, citing insufficient evidence and potential risks of malnutrition in oncology patients. You cannot cut off a cancer cell's fuel supply through dietary carbohydrate restriction. The system has too many alternative energy sources. The Warburg effect is legitimate science attached to a conclusion it does not support. 36. You are eating wasabi at your sushi restaurant. Green paste, sharp heat, authentically Japanese, applied carefully because it is intense and deserving of respect. You have been eating dyed horseradish and mustard powder in green food coloring, and with very few exceptions, this has been true every time you have ordered sushi outside of a high-end specialist restaurant. Real wasabi, Wasabia japonica, is an aquatic plant native to Japanese mountain stream riverbeds and is extraordinarily difficult and expensive to cultivate, requiring cold, clean, fast-moving water and 18 to 24 months to reach maturity. Fresh wasabi loses its signature volatile compound, allyl isothiocyanate, within 15 to 20 minutes of grating, making it functionally impossible to serve as a pre-made paste even in establishments that could afford to use the real plant. The paste served at approximately 95 to 99% of sushi restaurants outside Japan is a mixture of Western horseradish, also from the Brassicaceae family and sharing the same heat mechanism, mustard powder, green food coloring, and sometimes cornstarch. Real wasabi provides a more nuanced, complex heat that dissipates quickly and does not linger aggressively. The extended sinus-clearing burn most people associate with wasabi is the horseradish substitute, not the plant they believe they are consuming. In Japan itself, the majority of restaurants also serve the horseradish blend. Real wasabi commands a significant price premium and is reserved for high-end omakase experiences where the cost is already substantial. The isothiocyanates in real wasabi have been studied for potential antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, and the horseradish substitute contains similar compounds in different proportions. You have been clearing your sinuses with horseradish and green cosmetics for your entire sushi eating life. The burning was always authentic. The ingredient was not. 37. Farmed salmon is chemical saturated, artificially colored, antibiotic laden, and nutritionally inferior to wild-caught salmon in every meaningful way. Wild-caught is pure, traceable, and worth every additional dollar on the label. The distinction between the two is health versus something considerably worse. The wild versus farmed salmon comparison is more nuanced than the premium pricing and wellness content suggest, and the clean narrative attached to wild-caught deserves more scrutiny than it typically receives. Farmed Atlantic salmon typically has higher total omega-3 content than wild-caught Pacific salmon because farmed fish are fed omega-3 rich diets specifically calibrated for fat deposition. The pink to red color of farmed salmon does come from synthetic astaxanthin added to feed, but astaxanthin, whether synthetic or naturally derived from krill and algae, is a legitimate antioxidant used in both fish feed and human supplements. Polychlorinated biphenyl contamination concerns in farmed salmon were documented in a widely cited 2004 study published in Science. Subsequent analyses found that levels in most commercially available farmed salmon fall below EPA safety thresholds and have declined significantly as fish feed formulation has improved. Antibiotic use in salmon aquaculture varies dramatically by country. Norwegian farm salmon uses near zero antibiotics due to widespread vaccination programs, while operations in other regions have historically used more, meaning country of origin matters significantly to this specific concern. Wild-caught salmon is not contamination-free. It bioaccumulates mercury and other environmental pollutants through its natural food chain, with levels varying significantly by species and catch location. The species matter more than the farming designation in many nutritional comparisons. Wild sockeye has a different fat profile than wild Atlantic or farmed coho. Wild caught on a label is not a purity certificate. Farmed is not a chemical admission. Both categories contain multitudes that the price difference does not explain. 38. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, and potatoes belong to the nightshade family. Nightshades contain alkaloids. Alkaloids cause systemic inflammation, and anyone with arthritis or chronic joint pain should eliminate them entirely. This is the nightshade inflammation hypothesis, and it is based on a loose mechanistic argument that has not been substantiated in clinical research with the general population. Nightshades do contain alkaloids, primarily solanine in potatoes, tomatine in tomatoes, and capsaicin in peppers. At the concentrations found in commercially grown edible varieties, these compounds are metabolized normally in the vast majority of people without producing any adverse effect. Solanine toxicity at high doses is real and documented, but the doses present in food-grade nightshades are orders of magnitude below any threshold associated with measurable harm in human physiology. No randomized controlled trial has demonstrated that nightshade elimination reduces arthritis symptoms or systemic inflammatory markers in people without a specifically diagnosed nightshade sensitivity. Rheumatology guidelines and the Arthritis Foundation do not recommend nightshade avoidance as an evidence-based intervention for any form of arthritis. Tomatoes and peppers are rich in antioxidants, lycopene, vitamin C, and quercetin, with documented anti-inflammatory properties in research. Eliminating them specifically to reduce inflammation removes the very compounds most relevant to that goal, which is a peculiar strategy. The nightshade restriction is common in autoimmune protocol diets where broad elimination is used as a diagnostic strategy. Individual sensitivity to nightshades does exist in a subset of people and is worth investigating through a proper elimination protocol under guidance. But this is a documented individual response, not a universal mechanism. The tomato was declared an inflammation agent by dietary philosophy, not by rheumatology. The evidence has not caught up with the conviction, and for most people, the tomato on your plate is not the reason your knee hurts. 39, the bag says triple washed. It is pre-cut, pre-cleaned, and processed through industrial food safety protocols so thorough that opening it and eating directly from it is the entire intended use case. Pre-washed bagged salads have been the source of numerous documented foodborne illness outbreaks, and the triple wash designation does not mean what most consumers assume it guarantees. The CDC has documented multiple large-scale E. coli 0157H7 and Salmonella outbreaks directly traced to pre-washed bagged leafy greens, including spinach, romaine, and spring mix, in the United States. Triple wash describes a manufacturing process, not a guarantee of pathogen-free status. The wash is typically a dilute chlorine solution that reduces but does not eliminate bacterial contamination, particularly when bacteria have been internalized into leaf tissue rather than sitting on the surface. Once E. coli or Listeria contamination enters a processing facility, cross-contamination through wash water, shared equipment, and handling can distribute bacteria across entire production batches simultaneously. Washing pre-wash bagged salad at home with tap water is not meaningfully effective at further reducing bacterial load and may actually spread residual bacteria around your sink surface. Cut leaf surfaces create additional entry points for bacterial penetration compared to whole leaves, and the cut and package state accelerates microbial growth during the transport and retail storage window that precedes your purchase. High-risk consumers, immunocompromised individuals, elderly people, and pregnant women are specifically advised by FDA food safety guidelines to exercise additional caution with pre-cut bagged produce. Triple washed is a manufacturing process designation, not a safety certificate issued after independent pathogen testing. The convenience package has been at the center of enough CDC outbreak investigations that the phrase ready to eat deserves a more measured reading than the packaging has been encouraging. The bag opens easily. That is what the design optimized for. 40. Matcha gives you calm, focused energy without the jitters because it either contains no caffeine or contains so little that it does not function as a stimulant. The energy is different, serene, sustained, zen, produced by L-theanine rather than caffeine. The L-theanine is real. The absence of caffeine is not. A standard serving of matcha, 1 teaspoon, approximately 2 grams of powder, contains approximately 60 to 70 milligrams of caffeine, comparable to, or slightly less than, a standard shot of espresso at 63 to 75 milligrams. Matcha is a concentrated powdered form of green tea made from shade-grown leaves. The shading process increases chlorophyll and L-theanine content specifically, but it does not reduce caffeine content. It actually concentrates it relative to steeped green tea because you are consuming the entire ground leaf rather than an infusion. L-theanine is a non-protein amino acid that increases alpha brain wave activity, associated with relaxed alertness, and moderates the acute cardiovascular and anxiety response to caffeine. This is the mechanism behind the calm focus description, and it is a real and documented effect. L-theanine does not eliminate caffeine's adenosine receptor antagonism or its stimulant pharmacology. It refines the subjective experience of the caffeine, not the caffeine itself. Caffeine-sensitive individuals, people managing anxiety disorders, pregnant women, and anyone on a caffeine-restricted protocol for any medical reason need to account for Matcha's caffeine content with the same diligence applied to any other caffeinated beverage. The calm, focused narrative in Matcha marketing systematically obscures the caffeine content in ways that cause unintended consumption for people actively managing their intake. Matcha has caffeine. L-theanine makes the caffeine feel more civilized, not absent. Describing Matcha's energy as different from coffee is accurate. Describing it as caffeine-free is misinformation with good ceremony arranged around it. 41. You switch to sea salt and your sodium intake is no longer a concern. Sea salt is natural, minimally processed, visually beautiful, and arrives in pink, gray, and black varieties that communicate care and quality. Table salt is industrial. This swap felt like an upgrade. Sea salt and table salt have essentially identical sodium content. The crystals are larger, the sodium is the same. Both table salt and sea salt are approximately 97 to 99% sodium chloride. The elemental sodium content per teaspoon varies slightly based on crystal size, but not because of any chemical difference between the products. Because sea salt crystals are often larger or flakier, measuring by volume yields slightly fewer sodium milligrams per teaspoon than finely ground table salt. This is a packing density difference. The same weight of each product contains the same sodium. Sea salt does contain trace minerals from ocean mineral content, including magnesium, potassium, and calcium. These are present in quantities too small to have any meaningful nutritional impact at the amounts consumed as seasoning. The cardiovascular risk associated with high sodium intake, elevated blood pressure through fluid retention, is caused by sodium ions, not by any associated mineral compound or production method. Iodine is added to most table salts since the 1920s, specifically to prevent iodine deficiency and thyroid disorders. It is typically absent from artisan sea salts, which is a genuine nutritional consideration for anyone who has replaced all table salt with specialty varieties and relies on dietary iodine from that source. The price premium for sea salt can be 10 to 20 times that of table salt per weight, reflecting harvest method, texture, and marketing rather than any documented health advantage. You bought a more expensive sodium chloride with a better origin story. Your sodium intake did not improve when you switched to the flaked gray variety. 42. Agave nectar is natural, plant-derived, low glycemic, and a responsible choice for anyone managing blood sugar. People with diabetes and weight concerns adopted it as the guilt-free sweetener, the one you could use with awareness that you are making a better decision. Agave's low glycemic index comes from being composed almost entirely of fructose, the form of sugar that bypasses blood glucose measurement entirely while going directly to the liver with its own distinct set of metabolic consequences. Commercial agave syrup contains 70 to 90% fructose by composition, making it higher in fructose than high fructose corn syrup, which is typically 55% fructose. Fructose is metabolized almost exclusively in the liver rather than in peripheral tissues and does not trigger the same insulin or blood glucose response as glucose, which is the precise mechanism behind the low glycemic index. High fructose intake overloads the liver's metabolic capacity, and excess fructose is converted to fat through a process called de novo lipogenesis. This contributes to hepatic fat accumulation, elevated triglycerides, and insulin resistance, metabolic outcomes that are diametrically opposed to the health positioning of agave in the wellness market. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease research consistently identifies fructose overconsumption as a particularly significant contributor to hepatic fat accumulation, separate from overall caloric intake. The agave plant is real and historically meaningful in Mexican tradition. commercial agave syrup is a highly refined industrial product, more chemically distant from the raw plant than table sugar is from sugarcane, despite the natural origin claim on the front of the bottle. The diabetic-friendly labeling is based solely on glycemic index, a single metric that measures only glucose response and ignores fructose's distinct and arguably more problematic metabolic destination. You replaced a sugar that raises blood glucose with one that bypasses it entirely to reach your liver directly. The glycemic index does not measure what is happening in your liver. 43. Plant milks are the evolved choice, whether almond, oat, soy, or rice. They have replaced dairy in millions of diets with the assumption that nutritional equivalency was built into the substitution. The packaging implies it. The cultural moment around plant-based eating confirms it. Most non-dairy milks do not match cow's milk nutritionally without significant fortification, and the degree of mismatch varies enormously by type. Cow's milk provides approximately 8 grams of complete protein per cup, containing all essential amino acids in bioavailable quantities. Almond milk contains approximately 1 gram per cup, oat milk 2 to 3 grams, and rice milk 1 gram. For anyone relying on these as a primary dairy replacement and consuming protein in quantities typical of dairy users, this is a substantial and largely invisible deficit. Soy milk is the nutritional exception, providing approximately 7 to 8 grams of complete protein per cup with a protein digestibility score comparable to dairy. It is the only plant milk that meaningfully substitutes for cow's milk on protein grounds. Calcium, vitamin D, vitamin B12, and riboflavin in most non-dairy milks are added through fortification. They are not naturally present in the plant base. Fortification levels vary between brands and can be inconsistent across production batches. The bioavailability of calcium from fortified plant milks, typically calcium carbonate or tricalcium phosphate, is generally 10 to 30% lower than from dairy, depending on the food matrix. Oat milk, the fastest growing plant milk category, is primarily starch-based, containing approximately 16 to 24 grams of carbohydrates per cup with minimal protein. A macronutrient profile that is not equivalent to dairy on any meaningful measure. For children, elderly individuals, and anyone with elevated protein or calcium needs, assuming nutritional equivalency without scrutinizing labels can create genuine micronutrient gaps over time. Plant milks are real foods. They are not nutritional clones. The carton is only equivalent to dairy if someone added what was not there originally. 44. Fat-free peanut butter saves you calories. Regular peanut butter has fat, fat-free peanut butter has none, and no fat means fewer calories. This is the complete algebra. You made the responsible selection and registered it as a meaningful dietary improvement. Fat-free peanut butter replaces the removed fat with refined carbohydrates and added sugar, arriving at nearly the same caloric total with a less satiating and more glycemically active ingredient profile. Regular peanut butter contains approximately 190 calories per 2 tablespoon serving, with 16 grams of fat, predominantly monounsaturated, 7 grams of protein, and 6 grams of carbohydrates. Reduced fat peanut butter contains approximately 187 calories per 2 tablespoon serving, a reduction of roughly 3 calories achieved by replacing fat with added sugars, corn syrup solids, and refined starches that restore the texture and palatability that fat removal eliminates. The fat in regular peanut butter is primarily oleic acid, the same monounsaturated fat found in olive oil associated with favorable cardiovascular outcomes in multiple large-scale observational studies. Removing this fat and replacing it with refined carbohydrates increases the glycemic impact of the product without meaningfully reducing caloric load. A straightforward nutritional downgrade dressed as an improvement. The satiety effect of dietary fat combined with protein is significantly greater than from equivalent carbohydrate calories. Fat-free peanut butter is less filling per calorie consumed, not more, which frequently results in larger portions or faster return of hunger. The same structural pattern applies broadly to reduced fat food products. Removing fat requires replacing it with something to maintain palatability, and that replacement is almost invariably sugar or starch. You remove the monounsaturated fat, added refined sugar to keep the product edible, saved 3 calories per serving, and created something less satiating. The label change was impressive. The metabolic outcome was not. 45. Brown rice is strictly superior to white rice in every nutritional dimension. White rice is a refined, stripped, nutritionally hollow food. Brown rice is whole grain, fiber rich, and the objectively correct choice. If you are eating white rice, you're making a knowable mistake that better informed people have already corrected. Brown rice has a meaningfully better nutritional profile in some parameters. It also has a worse one in others. The automatic superiority verdict left out several complications that matter. Brown rice contains more fiber, approximately 3.5 grams versus 0.6 grams per cup cooked, along with more magnesium, phosphorus, and B vitamins than white rice. These are real advantages, particularly for populations eating rice as a primary dietary staple. Brown rice is also significantly higher in phytic acid, an anti-nutrient that binds to zinc, iron, calcium, and magnesium in the gut, reducing their absorption. The minerals brown rice contains in higher quantities are partially offset by this binding effect, making the net nutritional advantage smaller than the raw comparison suggests. Brown rice contains measurably higher levels of inorganic arsenic than white rice, because arsenic concentrates in the outer bran layer that is retained in brown rice and removed in white rice processing. Regulatory bodies in several countries have issued specific consumption frequency guidance for brown rice targeted at young children and pregnant women. The glycemic index advantage of brown rice over white is modest, approximately 50 to 55 versus 64 to 72. A difference that narrows further when rice is consumed as part of a mixed meal with fat and protein. Asian populations consuming white rice as a dietary staple for thousands of years historically showed lower rates of metabolic disease than Western populations consuming far less of it. Brown rice is better in some ways and more complicated in others. The hierarchy was more confident than the evidence supporting it. 46. The alkaline diet recommends that you eat alkaline foods, primarily fruits, vegetables, and specific grains, to change your body's pH balance, making the internal environment less hospitable to cancer cells, which thrive in acidic conditions. If you alter your tissue pH through diet, you alter the tumor microenvironment and undermine cancer's ability to function. Dietary alkalinity cannot meaningfully change tumor microenvironment pH. The mechanism being sold applies incorrect physiology to a real biological observation. Tumor microenvironments are genuinely acidic. This part is accurate. The acidity is a consequence of the Warburg effect, specifically aerobic glycolysis producing lactic acid, combined with poor vascularization and limited oxygen supply within tumor tissue. These are local variables determined by the tumor's own internal metabolic activity, not by systemic dietary pH management. Blood pH is regulated within an extremely narrow range of 7.35 to 7.45 by the kidneys and lungs through continuous buffering, a process that occurs before any dietary change could influence the tumor's internal environment. The interstitial pH of tumors is independent of what you eat because it is determined by the tumor's own metabolism and its surrounding vascular architecture, not by your breakfast. Researchers pursuing tumor microenvironment pH modification as a therapeutic strategy are doing so through sodium bicarbonate infusion, targeted metabolic drugs, and direct intervention protocols, not dietary alkalinity regimens. A study examining bicarbonate administration, a direct alkalizing agent, showed limited and context-specific results in animal models. Eating leafy greens does not achieve this. The alkaline diet does encourage consuming more fruits and vegetables while limiting processed foods. a pattern genuinely associated with reduced cancer risk through fiber, antioxidants, and phytochemicals. This benefit is real. It has nothing to do with pH. The vegetables are doing the work. The acid-base theory is the story wrapped around them to sell a book. 47 saturated fat from food enters your bloodstream, hardens, and sticks to artery walls like cold grease poured down a kitchen drain, accumulating over time into blockages that restrict blood flow and eventually cause the cardiovascular events you have been advised to prevent by avoiding the fat in the first place. Atherosclerosis is a complex inflammatory disease involving immune response, oxidative stress, and lipid metabolism. It is not a plumbing problem, and the drain metaphor has done considerable damage to the quality of nutritional discourse. The clogged pipe model was the foundational public metaphor of the diet heart hypothesis, but it fundamentally misrepresents the biology of arterial disease. Arteries are dynamic biological tissue containing immune cells, smooth muscle, and endothelial regulatory systems, not static pipes with fixed walls. Atherosclerosis begins with endothelial dysfunction and inflammatory processes. Oxidized LDL, not intact dietary fat, is taken up by macrophages that accumulate in arterial walls, forming foam cells that create the plaques associated with cardiovascular risk. Dietary saturated fat raises both LDL and HDL cholesterol, with the effect varying significantly by fat type. Lauric and palmitic acids raise LDL, while stearic acid, the primary saturated fat in beef and chocolate, has a neutral effect on LDL and is converted to oleic acid after absorption. The 2020 Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee acknowledged substantial evidence that replacing saturated fat with unsaturated fat reduces cardiovascular disease risk, while also noting that the source and food matrix matters significantly. Saturated fat from processed meat behaves differently in epidemiological outcomes than saturated fat from dairy. Plaque vulnerability, the likelihood of rupture and subsequent clot formation, appears to matter more for acute cardiovascular event risk than plaque size, which is an inflammatory story, not a mechanical one. Cardiovascular disease is not a drain blockage. The plumbing metaphor was effective communication and imprecise science. 48. A glass of warm lemon water first thing in the morning activates the liver, boosts your metabolism, initiates fat burning, and alkalizes the body. Starting the day with a ritual that shifts your metabolic trajectory before you have done anything else. Your liver was already working. It did not need a citrus prompt, and no documented mechanism connects lemon water to any of the functions being credited to it. The liver operates continuously, producing bile, synthesizing proteins, metabolizing hormones, and processing metabolic byproducts throughout every hour, including sleep, without requiring a morning beverage to initiate any of this activity. Fat metabolism is regulated by hormonal signals, primarily insulin, glucagon, and cortisol, alongside energy balance and substrate availability. None of these variables are meaningfully altered by lemon water consumption at the quantities involved in a morning glass. Lemon juice does contain vitamin C and citric acid. Vitamin C is a functional antioxidant and cofactor for multiple enzymatic processes. Citric acid participates in the Krebs cycle, but the Krebs cycle is a metabolic process already operating continuously in every cell in your body, not a furnace that requires a citrus match to ignite. The alkalizing effect attributed to lemon water is based on the fact that lemon's residual ash, after metabolic processing, is slightly alkaline, which still cannot overcome the body's buffering systems to produce any change in blood pH as established by basic physiology. Lemon water can contribute to daily hydration, and vitamin C from any source supports immune function and collagen synthesis. These are genuine, modest benefits worth acknowledging. Any correlation between morning lemon water and weight management in observational reports is most plausibly explained by the associated behavioral pattern. People who perform consistent morning health rituals also tend to make other consistent health decisions across the day. Your liver was already working, the lemon made the water taste better. 49. If you are serious about training, pre-workout is non-negotiable. It separates results from effort. The stimulant effect, the skin tingling, the sharpened focus, That is what committed training requires, and skipping it means leaving measurable performance on the table. Caffeine genuinely works as an ergogenic aid. Several other ingredients in pre-workout formulas are essentially dosing theater. None of them are required for muscle development. The evidence-based active ingredients in most pre-workout formulas are caffeine, well established for improving power output, endurance, and cognitive focus during training, and creatine monohydrate, the most extensively researched performance supplement available, with genuine documented benefits for strength and hypertrophy across hundreds of trials. Beta-alanine, which produces the characteristic skin-tingling paresthesia that many users interpret as a signal of pharmacological activity, has modest evidence for buffering muscular acidosis in high-repetition endurance contexts. The tingling is a side effect of nerve receptor activation, not an indicator that the compound is working effectively. Citrulline malate, L-arginine, and nitric oxide precursors produce mild pump effects and some blood flow enhancement. Evidence for these compounds improving actual strength or hypertrophy outcomes in controlled trials is inconsistent and generally weak. Many pre-workout formulas use proprietary blends that legally obscure the actual dosages of individual ingredients behind a collective blend weight, meaning active ingredients may be present at sub-effective doses while the packaging implies clinical relevance. Stimulant content ranges from 100 to 400 milligrams of caffeine per serving across brands. Tolerance develops rapidly with daily use, requiring dose escalation to achieve the same subjective effect, a pattern that mirrors standard stimulant tolerance progression. Muscle growth is driven by progressive mechanical overload, sufficient total protein intake, and adequate recovery. None of this requires a supplement to initiate or sustain. The tingling meant your nerves noticed. That is all the tingling meant. 50, the container says microwave safe, which you reasonably interpret as a regulatory certification that nothing in the plastic transfers to your food when the container is heated. Microwave safe means the container will not warp or melt under typical microwave conditions. It says nothing about whether the plastic leaches compounds into your food during heating, because that is not what the designation was designed to test. The FDA's microwave safe designation evaluates structural integrity at typical microwave temperatures, specifically whether the container becomes too hot to handle or deforms under heat stress. Chemical migration from plastic to food under heating conditions is a separate question that the designation does not address. Phthalates and bisphenols, including BPA and its replacement compounds, BPS and BPF, are plasticizing compounds used in food contact plastics that are documented to migrate into food, with migration rates increasing significantly at elevated temperatures. A 2011 study published in Environmental Health Perspectives tested 455 commercially available plastic food containers and found that nearly all leached estrogenic chemicals under microwave conditions, including products explicitly labeled BPA-free. BPA-free labeling, which proliferated after consumer concern about bisphenol A mounted, frequently indicates replacement with BPS or BPF, structural analogs with similar endocrine-disrupting activity that have undergone considerably less regulatory scrutiny than the compound they replaced. Microplastic contamination from plastic containers heated repeatedly has been documented in multiple recent studies. A 2023 study found that polypropylene containers release millions of microplastic particles when microwaved under standard conditions. The precautionary recommendation for most environmental health researchers is to transfer food to glass or ceramic before microwaving. The microwave safe label was written to protect the plastic from the microwave experience. It was not written to protect you from the plastic. These are meaningfully different assurances. 51. Eat fermented foods, yogurt, kimchi, sauerkraut, kefir, because they are packed with beneficial bacteria that colonize your gut, rebuild your microbiome after antibiotic damage, stress, or poor diet, and restore the balance that modern living has systematically eroded. Fermented foods support gut health as part of a broader dietary pattern. They do not independently colonize or reconstruct a damaged microbiome, and the distance between those two claims is the entire gap between a beneficial food and a therapeutic intervention. The human gut microbiome contains approximately 38 trillion microbial cells from hundreds to thousands of species. The number of viable bacteria in a serving of commercial yogurt, typically 1 to 10 billion colony-forming units, represents a trivially small fraction of the total microbiome population and its daily fluctuation range. For bacteria from fermented foods to colonize the gut, they must survive stomach acid at pH 1.5 to 3.5, survive bile salts in the small intestine, and then successfully compete against entrenched resident species through a process called competitive exclusion, which makes permanent microbial colonization from dietary sources difficult in practice. A 2021 Stanford University study published in Cell found that a high fermented food diet did increase microbiome diversity and reduce markers of immune inflammation, a genuinely encouraging finding that the researchers did not describe as rebuilding a damaged microbiome. The strains in commercial fermented products are transient. They pass through providing short-term benefits without establishing permanent residence in most people. Microbiome recovery after antibiotic disruption takes months is largely driven by dietary fiber diversity that feeds resident bacteria rather than introducing new ones, and may not fully return to pre-antibiotic composition in some individuals. Medical probiotic interventions, pharmaceutical grade, strain-specific, high-dose preparations, are the appropriate clinical tool for documented dysbiosis, not a larger kimchi portion. Fermented foods are genuinely beneficial. They are a contribution, not a reconstruction. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.